The great thing about Jesus is that he's the Son of God.
Yeah, you're right. You know what else is really interesting? He's the Son of God. And on Easter, we celebrate the fact that he rose from the dead. Let me tell you how crazy that is. Have you ever had a pet, like a dog or a cat, that like maybe died?
When my grandma's dog gets really old, he's gonna die.
Does it make you sad? Okay, so wouldn't it be great if you knew that we didn't die at all? I think that'd be awesome, right? And this is what Jesus demonstrates to us, right? Because he rises from the grave and he tells us that this is going to happen for all of us. We're going to rise from the grave. As a matter of fact, if he didn't rise from the grave, then there's no hope for us. So it just gives, for me, like what's so special about Jesus is that it gives me hope that that unlike people who die, well, we're going to live forever if we accept Jesus as Savior. And that's one of the great things about Jesus.
The great thing about Jesus is that he's the Savior and he can heal people and we can't.
Yes, so true. Yeah, that's what's so great about Easter too, right? Because the reason why he can heal people is because he has power, right? He has all kinds of power, the power to heal people. He even had the power to rise from the grave. That's actually one of the things I love about the Easter story, is that when Jesus rises from the grave, he demonstrates to us, he proves to us he's not just another person. He's something special, right? Because who comes out of the grave? Only God can do that. Yeah, exactly. So that's what's so great about it, is that Jesus he shows us the love of God and the power of God. And that's what's so great about the Easter story, right? Is that he tells us that no matter what happens to us, we're eventually going to rise from the grave and be with him. That's, to me, the best part about Easter.
So, how do we know that the story of Easter is true and not just something we made up?
That's a great question. Now, so have you ever made up a story?
Yeah.
I have too. So I learned how to be a detective really from being a parent first. So when my kids would make up a story and try to fool me with it, I would separate them. Like I'll have one in one room, one in the other. And then I would ask all kinds of details about the story. So I do the same thing with suspects as a detective. I'll separate the suspects and then I'll interview them and see if their stories line up. And if they're not telling the truth, their stories don't line up. They're different. And that's how I can catch that it's not a true story. So there was a bunch of people who saw Jesus after he rose from the grave. And they gave their testimony about him. They told about him, right? So it turns out they were separated by thousands of miles. So there's no way they could confirm with each other the details of the story. So I would expect if they're lying that the details would be wildly different, because that's what happens when you separate people who aren't telling the truth. But it turns out when they compare the stories, they all match. So even though they could not communicate with each other, they end up telling the same story. And for me, that speaks more to them saying something true than saying something false, right? And so that's why it's one of many reasons why I think the resurrection story, as it's reported in the Gospels, is actually true.
How can we believe in miracles if we don't see them today?
Okay, so that's a good question. So how do we define a miracle, right? It's something that is outside of the natural world. And I always think of the natural world as all space and time and matter, right? And the only thing that works on space, time, and matter is like physics and chemistry. But why would we think that there's something outside of the natural realm, outside of space, time, and matter? I'll tell you why I think there is. So we're in a universe that began to exist. The science tells us that our universe is not infinitely old. It has a beginning. The science tells us that all space, time, and matter have a beginning. That's the universe, space, time, and matter. But that means whatever causes, because remember, things that have a beginning have a beginner. Mm-hmm. So whatever causes the universe to begin has to be outside of space, time, and matter. You can't create yourself. Mm-hmm. So that means there's something outside of space, time, and matter. That means there's something outside of nature. So let me give you an example of this. I have an iPhone. Here's my iPhone. So I'm going to drop my iPhone right now, right? Now, I'm a finite, limited being, but I can intercede and stop gravity. If there's a God outside of space, time, and matter, he could intercede and change the laws, intercede in the laws. So it turns out all the miracles in the New Testament, they're really not that big of a deal if there's an all-powerful being who created the universe. He could probably walk on water.
So how do we know Christ's resurrection is true?
Well, okay, so there's lots of good reasons to believe it's true, but let me just give you one narrow one and see if this helps at all. So have you ever lied to your parents?
Maybe.
You're not even going to commit to that, are you? Okay, but you know what happens, right? If we say something that's not true, and I did that, I've lied to my parents, and so, but at some point, did they ever catch you in the lie, or did they ever ask you about the lie?
Yes.
And so, at what point did you kind of give it up, or what point did you tell the truth?
Once they asked it multiple times.
Yeah, because it's pressure, right?
Yeah.
So the more pressure you get, the more likely you are to reveal a truth, especially if you know it's not true. And that's one of the things that was interesting to me, right? I'm listening to the stories that the disciples gave about the resurrection. They all claimed that they saw Jesus after he resurrected. And if you think about it, anyone could say that. But if you have a lot of pressure, if it's a lie and they know it's a lie, at some point, if the pressure is high enough, well, then you probably will tell the truth. Yeah. And I'll bet you your parents probably didn't threaten you with physical violence to get you to tell the truth. But it turns out the disciples were all threatened with physical violence. As a matter of fact, probably all but one or two died as martyrs, rather than simply say, okay, he didn't rise from the dead. Now, if you and I said as Christians today, well, I'm willing to die for what I believe about Jesus, it really wouldn't have much evidential power, right? Because we wouldn't know. We're trusting some other authority. But these are the people who actually said they saw it. These are the ones who think they know something they saw. If they won't change their story, that has huge value for me. The fact that these folks were pressured, they held to their story, even though they were separated by thousands of miles and didn't even know if anybody else was changing their story. So it's really because those eyewitnesses never changed their story, even though they were pressured. Because I know you and I, once we got pressured, we told the truth. But when they were pressured, they also told the truth. It just happened to be that Jesus rose from the grave.
So, how do we know that the stories of the apostles and the Bible itself weren't just made up later on in time?
Yeah, I think if you want to lie about Jesus, here's the way you do it. You wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say anything you want because, number one, there are no eyewitnesses who would know if you're lying. And then you wouldn't be an eyewitness, though, either. So the first thing I do when I'm looking at eyewitness reliability, I interview a lot of eyewitnesses, I want to know, were you really there? Because you say you're there, but were you really there? I need to know that because people will lie. They were trying to protect somebody they care about, whatever, they'll just lie. So I have to make sure that the person was on the scene. I need some way to corroborate that, right? So one of the ways, it comes down with the Bible, how early was it written? If it's written in the 3rd century, well, then it's too late. And you can say anything you want about Jesus. If it's written, though, in the early 1st century, well, at least it's written at a time when people could say, no. I knew Jesus. He was not that way. This is all a lie. So the closer it comes to the early 1st century, the more confident I am. So I had to figure this out, right? I was 35 and I was not a believer, so I just wanted to date the Gospels. So if you look at the book of Acts is written by a guy named Luke. He also wrote the Gospel of Luke. He wrote the Gospel of Luke first. The book of Acts just describes everything that the disciples do after the resurrection. Well, it turns out in the book of Acts, Luke never mentions the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That was a huge event. To not mention it, because remember in the Gospel of Luke, he says that Jesus predicted it. So why wouldn't you describe how it came true? This prediction I described over here, it actually came true. Nope, it's missing from the book of Acts. That happened in 70 AD. We know when that happened in history, yet it's missing from the book of Acts. There was a siege of Jerusalem, happens around 68-ish. That's also missing. Even as a matter of fact, in the book of Acts, Luke says that when he ends it, Paul is still alive. Well, we know that Paul dies in the mid-60s. He doesn't describe his death. He doesn't describe the death of Peter, same time, dies in the mid-60s. He doesn't describe the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who dies around 61. Look, Luke describes a lot of deaths, like the death of James, the brother of John. That's a nobody. Okay, that's somebody, but he's a nobody compared to James, the brother of Jesus. He dies around 44. So my question was, well, why are these things missing from the 60s and 70s in the book of Acts? Well, if it hasn't happened yet, you can't describe it. So I thought, well, maybe it's written in the early, like the 60s or maybe in the 50s. And when you look at the letters that Paul writes, he's quoting from Luke's gospel to the church in Corinth. Well, he wrote that letter in the early 50s. And he quotes them a passage from Luke's gospel. So apparently Luke's gospel is available to quote. So that means we're putting Luke's gospel in the 50s. Now we're only 20 years after the ministry of Jesus. And so then the question becomes, well, do we think that that story could travel 20 years before it was first written down? And I think it can for a couple of reasons. Number one, when I go to juries, I tell them all the time, because I'm only working cold cases, and these are like 35 years old, so my witnesses haven't seen this or talked about it for 35 years. So I will say to them, not every memory is equal. Valentine's Day, for example, if I asked you, if you had a girlfriend and what did you do for Valentine's Day 3 years ago, you might not remember. I've been with my wife for 43 years. We've had 43 Valentine's Day. I couldn't tell you about most of them. I've forgotten them. But if you ask me about Valentine's Day on 1988, well, I remember that day because that was the day we got married. So it turns out not every Valentine's Day is the same for me. The ones that are emotionally powerful or memorable, they stick out. Not every memory is the same. Well, you can imagine if you're out fishing, and you fish every day, so you can't remember, what one day is like next to the other. But if on one of those days a dude walks out to you on the water, okay, that's a day you will remember, okay? So these are the kinds of memories that are captured in the Gospels, the kinds of things you wouldn't forget. And one last thing. So I give talks, around the country where I talk about Jesus, and I give the same talks over and over and over again. So my daughter was with me one day, and she says, I've been listening to these talks for years. I could actually do your talk. And she's right, because she's heard it so often. As a matter of fact, if you were to compare my talks word for word over the last 10 years, you would see they're pretty much the same word. Even when I pause, it's the same in every talk. Why? Because I've been giving those talks every weekend for 10 years. Well, imagine if I was talking about Jesus every day for 20 years. It turns out your stories would be the same, and they would be locked down to the point where if I have to write out my messages now, I could write my talk out. It would be word for word what I've been saying for the last 10 years. If they were to do the same thing, they would write out word for word what they've been saying for 20 years. So I think it is early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, and I think that time gap of 20 years is not significant enough to have changed the story.
What makes the resurrection such a big deal? Other than wrongful persecution and physical trial, other people have gone through that great of a physical trial, maybe worse. So what makes it such a big sacrifice for Jesus?
Well, I think more than anything else, it's evidence for us centuries later. So Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians. He says, if this didn't happen, then we've been false witnesses, and you have no hope of your own rising from the dead later. And you've been lied to for all this time, because we're actually making a claim about history, that Jesus rose from the grave. And that's a claim you can test. If you think about it in the book of Acts, right, after Jesus ascends into heaven, the one strategy every disciple takes when talking about Jesus to others is that we saw him rise from the grave. And so, yes, it's important that we worship a God who knows our suffering, not because of the resurrection, because of the crucifixion. So when we talk about suffering, most of us have suffered in some way, but few of us have suffered the way that Jesus did when he was beaten, literally beaten to death. And they kept on raising the bar on how they were beating him until finally he suffered from those injuries and died. That kind of death, it helps us. Of all the gods that are in the pantheon of gods, all the gods and all the theistic worldviews, only Jesus has suffered this way and can understand our suffering, can understand as a human what it is to be, what it is to be in the world and have all the stuff in the world happen to you. So there is a part of it, the crucifixion side, that I think is powerful because it does help us to resonate with our own suffering. This is a God who understands suffering. But the resurrection then acts as a piece of evidence because, look, it could have happened there was no resurrection. Or what if it was just a wise preaching rabbi in the first century? Well, you might learn something from him, but wouldn't he just be like every other wise preacher in the last 2,000 years? Why would I care? Why would I favor Jesus over Baha'u'llah or Muhammad or Buddha or Confucius or Indra or Zoroaster or anyone else who allegedly said wise things? Well, it's the resurrection. Is I'm finding this way, if someone dies and rises from the grave, I have a tendency to listen to them because it seems like to me like they're in a different category, right? And so this is what happens with the resurrection. That's evidence that Jesus is speaking to us from a different category of authority. So that's why I think the resurrection is so powerful.